don't see it on here. Yeah, okay, I'll be right there.
Hi there. My 91 Cutlass Calais's got coolant in the oil. Weird looking stuff. Head gasket must be shot. So I'm here to get my new one installed. Actually, I'm Jim Scopolitis, and what I've just told you is instructional fiction. I've been out in the field recently because a number of perfectly good head gaskets are being replaced on account of what we call pancake batter in the oil, sometimes referred to as condensation. There's a lot of misunderstanding about pancake batter, and service consultants as well as technicians have a big job to do in avoiding misdiagnosis. There's something else adding to the confusion. The fact that owners of 1987 to 1991 Cutlass Calais's and Cutlass Supremes with Quad4 engines once received a letter from GM announcing that their head gaskets may need to be replaced. This is Tom McCarthy. He and I have reviewed pancake batter and what the service consultant needs to tell an owner about it. Later, I'll come back and run a check on how well he can do that.
Jim, I'm going to make your day.
For technicians, we'll cover diagnosis of a pancake batter condition. And at the end of the program, we'll introduce some very important new information about cleaning the cylinder head whenever a Quad4 head gasket does need replacing. So stay tuned.
Tom McCarthy. Oh, hi, Mr. O'Malley.
Let's go over to a Quad4 engine
sure.
and talk about all this.
How about 8 o'clock? 8 a.m.? Fine.
First, let's review what pancake batter is and how it happens, and see whether we can find any in the oil of this Quad4. No, this one looks pretty clean. Now, we might have seen more pancake batter if the weather had been really cold around here, especially if this car were usually driven in really short trips. With these earlier model Quad4s, it's not unusual or necessarily abnormal to see this much pancake batter on a Quad4 dipstick. You can see how the stuff got its name. Notice that it's light colored and that the oil beneath it looks normal. Pancake batter doesn't usually involve coolant in the oil. With coolant contamination, there's no really light color, and it's the oil itself that looks different. It looks cloudy or milky, like dark milk chocolate. Pancake batter is water in the oil, and in cold weather, some degree of water in engine oil is normal, because one of the chief substances remaining after combustion is water, lots of it. In fact, for every gallon of fuel that an engine burns, it creates about a gallon of water. Most of the water is sent out the tailpipe as vapor, but some gets past the piston rings. Unless this water is thoroughly evaporated by hot engine operation, it becomes suspended in the crankcase oil. This water isn't really condensation, but people often call it that. Pancake batter is a normal condition, and it's not at all harmful. It doesn't in any way affect the oil's ability to lubricate, or the engine's performance, or the life of the engine. And, by the way, changing the oil won't decrease the production of pancake batter. But there are several factors that increase its production. Cold weather, a driving schedule that consists mostly of short trips, and the use of gasohol or fuel with alcohol in it. Both cold weather and short trips may prevent the engine from heating up enough to evaporate the water. And using fuel with alcohol in it may leave more water in the crankcase than burning regular fuel does. In cold weather, all engines can create pancake batter, which will then coat adjacent engine surfaces. You're likely to see more of it on a Quad4 for a couple of reasons. The first one involves some design features which help cool the engine. The Quad4 is a tall engine with lots of surface area exposed to air, including this broad flat front cover and an aluminum oil pan. These features mean the oil tends to stay relatively cool. The second reason involves the design of the crankcase ventilation system. As you know, with the Quad4, blow-by gases from the crankcase are drawn from behind the front cover through this hose to the oil-air separator. There, the gases are separated out and routed through another hose to the air intake duct for reburning. And the accompanying oil, which may include pancake batter, is routed back to the crankcase through a third hose beneath the separator, which feeds into the oil-fill tube. I'll show you that connection. This is a more recent version of the separator. Oil and pancake batter flow down here and through the oil-fill tube on the way back to the crankcase, leaving a high percentage of batter to coat the surfaces along the way. That means whenever someone pulls out the oil level indicator, the ball on the end wipes the fill tube wall, collecting lots of batter. So with the Quad4, if there's any pancake batter, you sure see it on the dipstick. Where else can you see it? Technicians often find it behind the front cover. And, as you'd expect, in those hoses and connections of the crankcase ventilation system. Now, what should be done if there's a customer complaint involving pancake batter? Obviously, it needs to be checked out. But it's most likely to be one of two things. Either a normal condition involving weather and possibly the owner's driving pattern, or the result of a failing thermostat, which is preventing the engine from getting as hot as it should. The problem is that some technicians misdiagnose pancake batter, either thinking it's caused by a faulty oil-air separator and replacing that, or thinking what they're looking at is coolant in the oil and replacing the head gasket. Actually, we're seeing a large number of mistakenly replaced head gaskets. And there's one Quad4 engine out there that's had 3 head gasket replacements in the past year because of a pancake batter condition. Of course, after each repair, there was no reduction in pancake batter until the thermostat was replaced. Let's take the separator first. Since 1990, the separator has been a simple box. There's nothing inside here to fail. So with a Quad4 from 1990 or later, don't replace this hoping to reduce pancake batter. The 87 to 89 separator is different. It has baffles in it. Occasionally these may break up, disintegrate, and plug up the vent system, possibly increasing the production of batter. So with an 87 to 89 Quad4, you should take off the separator, shake it, and listen for broken parts. No rattle. If you do hear a rattle, it's faulty. Replace it. What about head gaskets? Can they ever fail and cause a buildup of pancake batter? We've already said that generally coolant in oil doesn't look like this, but you shouldn't diagnose your customer's complaint on the look of the oil alone. Bulletin 91T 244A, issued in August of 1993, includes a list of checks necessary to verify a Quad4 head gasket concern, and important procedures to be followed when a head gasket does need to be replaced. There's an STG video on the same subject. Its diagnostics section reviews the symptoms to check for when you suspect a head gasket concern. For our purposes, loss of coolant is the big one. When an owner suspects a head gasket leak because of pancake batter and there are no symptoms of other kinds of engine trouble, the service consultant should check the coolant level and ask whether coolant's been added recently. If the vehicle isn't losing coolant, tell the owner right up front that a thorough check will be made. But it's most likely that the level of pancake batter is either normal or caused by a failing thermostat, not the head gasket. By the way, beginning right about now, new Quad4s are being assembled, not with the familiar Goertz gasket, but with this new one made by Victor. Okay, now let's talk about thermostats. Some early Quad 4 thermostats have tended to drift to the cold side over time. Of course, the main job of these thermostats is to remain closed when coolant temperature is low, thereby restricting the coolant flow from the engine to the radiator. And then, when the temperature rises into the normal operating range, to open, allowing coolant flow to and from the radiator to maintain engine temperature. During normal engine operation, unless the weather is below about 10 degrees Fahrenheit or above 80, cycling happens at least once per minute. This cycling is easily observable on the temperature gauge as the needle rises steadily from the second heavy hash mark to about halfway to the third and back again. If one of these shifts to the cold side, the needle may rise as far as the low end of the normal operating range and stay there. What may be happening is that the thermostat is opening at a lower temperature than normal, so the engine runs cooler than it should. The water from combustion isn't completely evaporated, and pancake batter increases. In these cases, replacing the thermostat should really cut down on pancake batter. And if you do replace a stat, it's important to remember and tell the customer that now, except when the weather is hot or extremely cold, the gauge needle will cycle. Cycling is an indication that it's working right. Never drill holes in a Quad 4 thermostat to stop the gauge needle from cycling. That might stop the cycling all right and ruin the stat. Everything we've said about cycling applies to pre-1994 thermostats. The 1994 stat is totally new and part of a totally new cooling system. Its gauge does not cycle. Obviously, it's important to remember that, too. You've noticed that with pancake batter, service consultants need to be really sharp at explaining things to customers. Let's go see how well Tom can do. After that, we'll look at the steps in diagnosing pancake batter, especially checking the thermostat. And we'll end with that important new information about cleaning the Quad 4 engine head. Okay, Tom, here's your test. I'm John Jones. I'm new in town, and my 1991 Cutlass Calais has coolant in the oil, and I'm here for a head gasket replacement.
What symptoms do you notice?
No symptoms, but I can see the stuff on the end of the dipstick.
Mr. Jones, have you had to add coolant recently?
No.
Or noticed lots of white exhaust even after the engine heats up?
No. Look, I can see the junk on the dipstick.
Okay. Then I'd say, why don't we go to the car and you can show me the dipstick?
All right. Dipstick. See? There it is.
Ah, well, Mr. Jones, that light-colored stuff looks like what we call pancake batter, which is water in the oil. Coolant in oil generally gives it a dark, milky look.
Listen, I got a letter here says I may need a head gasket replacement.
True, and we'll check that out. But I think you'll find the letter also says important symptoms of head gasket problems are loss of coolant and lots of white exhaust, even when the engine's warm. Tell me, do you drive long distances?
Just a couple miles to work each day.
Well, that's part of the story. Combustion always produces water, which becomes suspended in the oil unless the engine's hot enough to evaporate the water. That's especially true with the efficient Quad 4, which runs its oil slightly cooler anyway. If you drove farther to work, you'd see a lot less pancake batter. Oh, by the way, do you use gasohol?
No.
Well, I asked because that could increase the amount of water dropping into the crankcase. Anyway, by itself, pancake batter isn't a problem. It doesn't reduce the oil's ability to lubricate at all. We'll check your engine out thoroughly, however. And one thing we'll look at is your thermostat. If it's beginning to fail, it could be causing the engine to run unusually cool.
Well, my thermostat's fine. The needle rises to the right place and parks there till I shut the engine off.
Well, actually, with your 1991 Quad 4, that's a sign that the thermostat's failing. Except when the weather is hot or extremely cold, the needle should steadily move up and down as the stat keeps the engine in correct temperature range. We'll check everything out, but I suspect your car needs new thermostat. If so, you should see less pancake batter afterward. Oh, and a temperature gauge needle that keeps swinging. So don't think it's faulty when it does that.
I think I'll have to pass this guy. Good job. Guess you had a good coach.
Well, I guess you had a good student.
Come on. Once the service consultant has explained things to the customer, the technician takes over. Here are the steps in the complete process. When there's pancake batter with no other engine symptoms, confirm that coolant isn't being lost, so you can rule out a head gasket problem. If there may be coolant loss or other engine symptoms were mentioned, proceed to the series of checks listed in Bulletin 91T 244A and that STG video. If the head gasket's okay, and if the engine's a 1987 to 89 model, check the separator by removing and shaking it. If it rattles, replace it. Next, check thermostat operation. Up through 1993 engines, a good way to do that is to check that the stat is cycling normally. As long as outdoor temperatures aren't really extreme, the stat should cycle. You service consultants can make the check. With a Tech 1 installed, take the car on the road. If necessary, turn on the heater until the defroster has defogged the windows. Then turn the heater off and watch the gauge for cycling. It may take up to 10 minutes with the heater off before the stat does start to cycle. When it does, monitor coolant temperature on the Tech 1 for a couple of minutes. In Fahrenheit degrees, you should see regular cycling between the mid-180s and the low 200s. The temperature should reach at least 195 degrees before beginning to descend. If the thermostat doesn't cycle or cycles without reaching a high of at least 195 degrees, replace it. Afterward, the owner should see less pancake batter. Incidentally, if the weather is very cold, keep the vehicle indoors overnight before you run this test. And at sub-zero temperatures, even a good stat might never cycle. To sum up, diagnosing pancake batter is this easy. If these three checks don't identify any problem, it's almost certain that you're looking at a normal condition. Now, suppose you do discover coolant loss and follow up to learn that some additional head gasket symptoms are present too. In that case, you do replace the head gasket using the instructions spelled out in Bulletin 91T 244A and the STG video. This information is very important, and you should be familiar with it. We've talked about cleaning engine surfaces in an earlier service alert release. But now we have new evidence about how much damage can be done by using abrasive pads. Abrasive pads can damage engines in three ways: by shortening gasket life, by ruining the flatness of the head, and by leaving aluminum oxide particles that end up scratching engine parts. To demonstrate how quickly you can ruin an aluminum Quad 4 head, here's Ken Pontius of GM Powertrain cleaning one using an abrasive pad. We'll call this How to Ruin a Head, Part 1. Ken notices these even-spaced indentations or bite marks on the head and decides to get rid of them. He shouldn't. Those marks aren't pitting. They're pressure marks made by the gasket when it's clamped tightly into position. But Ken starts working away at them. Right now, in the length of time that you're watching this shot, he's ruining it. In the space of 10 or 15 seconds, the damage is done. With these pads, it's nearly impossible to apply even pressure. Anytime the pad is tipped, the opposite side can dig into the head. Not knowing he's already bought the head, Ken continues. For proper sealing, the edges around all openings must be kept perfectly sharp and true. By trying to cut out combustion chambers with the abrasive pad, Ken is rounding off those edges and setting up trouble. Here's the completed job. Now, Ken checks it for flat, the right way. He checks both like this, with a long straight edge, and with a short straight edge across individual combustion chambers and areas he's worked on heavily. This kind of check is very important, and the tool to use is the 8-inch Kent-Moore tool J34673. Ken learns that in this spot, while we watched him do it, he has taken off 8/1000ths of an inch of aluminum. Too much. That's how to ruin the head. And it's not just aluminum that these are bad for. We've seen them take 8/1000ths off an iron block. Besides that, trying to clean combustion chambers, Ken has rounded off the edges of cylinders and fluid passages. In the crucial areas between cylinders, this rounding has reduced the gasket sealing area, which was already critically narrow. This is sure to shorten gasket life. Finally, small bits of aluminum oxide from the pad are very likely to have fallen into bores in the head. The newest bad news is that some of this grit can avoid being caught in the filter and damage engine parts, even wearing them out and causing engine failure. This bearing is normal. The scoring on this one, which looks like phonograph record grooves, was caused by particles from an abrasive pad. So was this. The message couldn't be clearer. Don't ever use an abrasive pad in gasket replacement. Watch for a new bulletin with this same message. What about metal scrapers? If you're very experienced, and if you used a brand new scraper every time, you might be able to avoid damaging the head. But you can't use a new one every time, and regrinding isn't good enough. Here's How to Ruin a Head, Part 2. Ken is using a metal scraper. Its edge felt sharp, but it's not sharp enough to let him keep his hand very low, with the scraper almost parallel to the head. Held at this angle, it can do lots of damage, making scratches near combustion chambers that can cause leaks, and actually shaving off those sharp edges of chambers and other openings. With results like this. And this. Plastic and wooden scrapers remain the safest way to do the job. But on a Quad 4, if they can't do the job, the safest alternative is a razor blade tool. But you must use a new blade every time. Be very careful not to scratch or gouge the surface. With great care, you can use one of these, but remember, a new blade every time. One last point. When you're reassembling the engine, use the revised bolt tightening sequence that's now standard for all Quad 4s. You'll find it in Bulletin 92T 244A and the STG video. Well, today we've discussed pancake batter on one hand and head gasket repair on the other. Usually these two subjects don't have anything to do with each other, and the biggest challenge may be helping owners understand that. See you next time.